modest, and the fact that he would have expected something of the scale that you would find at Tenochtitlan, for example, suggests that the English really did not have a good grasp on the scale and size of America. I also do wonder if this might have anything to do with the tale of the Genosqua, I'm not sure which particularly it is, but we covered it in our video about Bigfoot and feral people and all of that. It's a Haudenosaunee legend of a stone-clothed giant from the south who, comes north and is cannibalistic and all that, and I wonder if this has something to do with the English settlers coming with their steel armor and being unable to be harmed by stone axes and arrows. And of course, the legend could have passed to the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, from the Chesapeake and the Algonquin-speaking peoples, who of course also had their own stories of, you guessed it, the Wendigo. So it seems possible to me that the stone skin and the cannibalism come from two separate legends that merged into one. The Iroquois/Haudenosaunee peoples actually would end up driving a lot of the Algonquin speakers out of their native lands down south and to the east and to the north, and that could be how they arrived at this story of steel-skinned people. Not from encountering them themselves, but hearing about them from the Chesapeake and the Powhatan. I say that because the Iroquois may have never actually encountered these stone-skinned people, but rather when they were driving the Algonquin-speaking Lenape from their lands in Pennsylvania, they may have heard about these invaders from the south. As Amadas and his crew traveled around, they did start to notice something, or more particularly Thomas Harriot, the scientist on the expedition, began to notice something. And that was that every single village they visited was almost immediately beset by a sort of plague, some sort of epidemic that killed off a large number of the Native Americans. Now, despite having pattern recognition, they could not pinpoint why, and that's because germ theory was still 300 years away. They didn't know what was doing this to people. It was probably smallpox or influenza, but at the time, they did not know what caused sickness. It was believed that there were evil spirits, or that the air was somehow polluted in some way by something they called the miasma, and that when you went near a rotten corpse, it wasn't the bacteria that were going to cause you to get sick. It was some sort of evil air. Now, of course, this is not what that actually is. We know that now, but how are they going to know that then? It's not great anytime you get a whole bunch of new people sick, but it got worse because Chieftain Wingana also got sick, and his native shamans and healers did everything they could to make him better, but it wasn't until the Christians came, the English, and sat with him and prayed for him that he got better, that he recovered. And they did something that was definitely rational for them, but is not rational in hindsight, which is they said, oh, well, when the English came and prayed, he got better. So let's send the English around to pray for all the sick people in the other villages. Problem was, it wasn't prayer that made him better, it was luck, and all of the other Native Americans who then had the English praying for them ended up dying. So, great example of good intentions, bad outcome. And another unforeseen consequence of this decision to go around praying for everybody and these interactions, these more and more common interactions between English and Native, was that the amount of men in the settlement available to harvest was much lower. So the food crop yield that winter, that fall, was not what it needed to be for just the Secatan, let alone the English who were relying on them for food. That lack of food led to a general distrust between the natives and the English, who both felt that the situation was tenuous and their survival kind of depended on the other side maybe not doing so great. On top of all of that, Granganameo, the chieftain's brother, who was very pro-English, died that winter, which left things even worse because now there weren't really any strong voices in the Secatan tribe speaking on behalf of the colonists. Wingana, being very suspicious of the English colonists in the area, changed his name to Pemisipan, which means one who watches. Eventually, realizing that the situation was untenable, Ralph Lane went to Pemisipan and asked him if he had any thoughts about the English going further inland towards Chowanoke territory. And Pemisipan decided to play a little fun game and thought, you know what, maybe I can get rid of my rival without raising my axe. So, Pemisipan told Ralph Lane that there was an alliance of inland natives who hadn't even met the colonists yet, who were organizing an alliance to go in and destroy the Roanoke colony, and that they were led by a Chowanoke leader named Menetonin. This native alliance allegedly numbered 3,000 men to Ralph Lane's 107. Lane, not wanting to be in a situation where he had to defend his fort against so many men, took a well-armed force inland, hoping to surprise the Chowanoke force. Now, this was really their only option. You might think of, for example, the movie Zulu, where a bunch of British soldiers with muskets and all of that managed to fend off a much larger army of Africans, but this was not the same circumstance. Typical narratives about the American colonization period are inextricably tied to a weapon called the musket, but the musket of 1585 was very different from the musket of 1700. Instead of being a handheld weapon, it was more like a small cannon. You would often take a mount made out of steel, pop the barrel onto that mount, and then hold the gun up to your shoulder and fire it. It was not the simple, line fire technique. There was a lot more that went into it. So at the time, this was not super different from the late medieval arquebus. And when compared with the Brown Bess musket used by the British during the colonial period, these were heavier, they were longer, they were less accurate, and they were more prone to misfires. 107 of these would, at best, take out 107 of those 3,000 natives, and then you'd have the remaining 2,900 or so after you. What we're talking about here is a firearm that would have been about 4 feet long and would have weighed over 10 pounds. Compare that to a modern carbine, and you're looking at something that weighs 6 to 7 pounds and is considerably shorter. So the colonists at Roanoke would have more likely been relying on their pikes and their swords, and there's been suggestions that maybe they had longbows or crossbows with them, but nothing has really been found to confirm that. If they had used those weapons, it's likely we would have found steel arrowheads. So when Lane's force arrived to hopefully surprise the Chowanoke and rout them before a battle could happen, what they found was a council that was meeting, but definitely not prepared for battle. So, without much effort, they managed to capture Menetanen as well as his son and force them to negotiate. However, when speaking with Menetanen, they discovered something very interesting. He thought that they were planning to attack him, and that's why he had called this whole war council. And who had given him the information that the colonists were planning to attack his people? Pemisipan, who set up the entire thing, hoping to get rid of both the rival to his east as well as the rival to his west. Menetanen also told Ralph Lane about a very wealthy and powerful kingdom to the northeast, likely the Powhatan Confederacy, and said that if he were to venture into that territory, he should go very heavily armed. You might be familiar with the Powhatan because of the story of Pocahontas and John Smith. Menetanen himself was ransomed back to his people, but in typical European custom of the time, his son, Skiko, was actually taken as a hostage. Hostage, of course, did not mean somebody who was kept tied up in a dungeon somewhere. They were typically kept within the main household of the governor or the lord or the king, and they were treated with a great deal of respect and given enough leisure to enjoy themselves and not feel trapped, but they weren't quite given the freedom to roam. Skiko told Lane about a place called Chaumis Temoatan, which was a source of valuable metals, and what Lane heard was gold and or copper. This was all very good information because Lane was realizing how bad the situation with the Secatan was getting. It had gone from distrust to Pemisipan actually tried to have him murdered, basically. So he planned to split his colony into two. One would head up the Chowan River towards Chowanoke territory and to explore looking for this source of gold or copper, and the other would go up north into the Chesapeake, hoping to settle up there where things were a little bit less tense. However, that meant that they needed to wait on Roanoke for supplies to arrive so that they could, of course, have the things they needed to go and attempt this, as well as send word back to England about where they were going. Those supplies were not going to arrive until around Easter, and it was still mid-March. Easter, of course, that year was April 6th. Lane himself, realizing that he had time until all of this came to pass, decided that he would send Skiko and a number of men back to Roanoke, and then he and 40 chosen men would head west along the Roanoke River, looking for gold or copper. Lane had hoped to sustain this 100-mile expedition by trading with the Moratuk and other peoples along the way. However, Pemisipan had told all of them that the English were hostile, so Every time they got to a village, they found that it was completely empty and the natives were hiding somewhere in the trees, or worse, they ambushed them. Despite all of this, Lane's men did manage to make it back, half-starved, to Roanoke by just after Easter, surprising Pemisipan so much that he decided to maybe change his strategy. An aspect of Pemisipan's decision to change his strategy with the English may have come from another Native American, part of the Secatan tribe, an elder named, I'm going to try to get this, Ensenor, or Ensenore, and he argued in favor of the colonists. Around the same time, messengers from Menetanen got there and told Lane that members of the Wepameoc tribe had pledged fealty to Queen Elizabeth I. This meant that Pemisipan was very quickly losing all of his advantages. However, the reprieve from hostilities was very short-lived because Ensenore passed away on April 20th, 1586, leaving basically no one in the Secatan camp to speak on behalf of and argue in favor of keeping good relations with the English. Things were pushed further along by Wanchese, who had decided, based on his time with the English, that they were in fact a very real threat, and it was better to get rid of them than to try and work with them. Pemisipan, who had actually ordered infrastructure built on Roanoke to help supply the colonists, ended up abandoning the colony, ordering an evacuation, leaving behind only a small force of warriors to hold their claim to the island, and then just left the English there. And worse, he